In the early days of the 2020s, American society was rocked by the sudden death of a beloved celebrity. Due to a distracted driving incident, actor Wesley Snipes, comedian Matt Walsh, and noted socialite Mr. Peanut were thrown from their vehicle and ended up suspended over a cliff, at which point Mr. Peanut selflessly sacrificed his own life to save his friends, plunging into the gorge below and blowing up along with the iconic Nutmobile. The tragic death of this 104-year-old celebrity was covered widely on social media and cable news, with many wondering how such a vibrant pillar of class and sophistication could be taken so soon, and many others wondering just what in the hell the Planters marketing team was on about. The deaths of fictional characters can often elicit a severe emotional reaction among fans. Climactic and irreversible deaths such as those of Tony Stark, Luke Skywalker, and Daniel Craig's Bond can be powerful enough to evoke the feeling of losing a loved one, although the audience is well aware that they never really existed. These characters have been with us for so long and gone through so much change and development that we feel a serious loss when we realize that we will never again follow their exploits on the silver screen. The same cannot or should not be said of corporate mascots. Characters such as Mr. Peanut, Tony the Tiger, and the Kool-Aid Man were designed for one specific purpose: to put a friendly face on a corporation. Even their ability to sell the company's actual products is secondary to their function as a mask, to humanize, to make familiar, to draw in consumers of all ages with the whimsy of a fun cartoon character. Sales stem from public perception of a company, and public perception stems from the company's identity. Corporate mascots have existed for years, but with the advent of social media, the push to personify them in the public eye has grown exponentially, with accounts on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter that represent companies such as Wendy's, Captain Crunch, and the Monopoly Man, who, let's face it, represents the Funko Pop of board games, leaning heavily into the cultivation of a unique personality, usually taking the form of recycled memes and self-promoting jokes. Even assuming that these accounts are operated by a single employee of these multinational corporations, which seems doubtful, Captain Crunch, Mr. Peanut, and the rest are not people. They don't even exist as an individual entity or consciousness, inanimate or otherwise. They are simply a concept, a mass-reproduced set of artwork and one-note character beats deliberately tailored to trigger a sense of familiarity and childlike excitement in the minds of the consumers. The transition of mascots onto social media feels like a natural direction for these companies, whose prime marketing technique is to falsely befriend the consumer. But the concept of mascots as individuals with voice and personality, more so than their short dialogue in TV ads,
Your choice. We'll fix your hamburgers however you say.
may have a more devious origin. Corporate humanism, the masking of diabolical intentions behind a lovable public persona, from activist executives to cartoon mascots, is the PR-centric equivalent to the more legally based and much more terrifying issue of corporate personhood. The practice of bestowing human rights on a collective began as far back as the 1st century BC, during which the Roman Republic granted certain privileges to entire cities, a natural progression from geographical divisions. These ancient Roman conglomerates were known as universitates, from the Latin in unum vertere, or from a multitude into one. However, while universitates enjoyed some of the same rights as human beings, a distinction was made between these groups and the individual. All people were considered sacred to the Romans, and even their slaves were granted the linguistic designation of humanity. The legislation of modern America makes no such distinction. In fact, the rights of corporations under our Constitution have grown exponentially as the rights of human beings are stripped away, or at least continue to stagnate. The modern corporation was originally developed in the fledgling United States, beginning with government-chartered banking companies, but this did not necessarily guarantee America's descent into a dystopian corporatocracy where the federal government will bail out a pair of companies for upwards of $90 billion after an economic crash, while doling out a paltry $1,200 per adult to those who have lost their homes and their entire town. Maybe a less actively anti-humanitarian form of capitalism could exist in an alternate United States, but with corporate personhood infiltrating both our legislation and our economy like an inseparable weed, we have always been headed for the day when corporations are considered more human than humans. 1819's Trustees of Dartmouth College v. Woodward was a landmark case for the Supreme Court and the first major stepping stone to corporate personhood and corporate humanism. After New Hampshire legislature attempted to cede control of Dartmouth's administration to the state government, essentially converting the private college into a public one, the Supreme Court decreed in a 5-1 vote that Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution, better known as the Contracts Clause, protected private institutions, as well as individuals, from invasive maneuvers by state government. Dartmouth College v. Woodward set a dangerous precedent by allowing corporations to cite the Contracts Clause, but this decision did not technically humanize conglomerates any more than the Universitates laws of ancient Rome. This would change in 1886's Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad Company, known as the Point of No Return and the Rise of Corporate Personhood. The county of Santa Clara, California sued Southern Pacific after the company refused to pay higher taxes than individuals. With the holding of Dartmouth College v. Woodward setting a precedent, the Supreme Court declared it unlawful to tax a corporation differently than an individual, resolving 3 such lawsuits at once. Santa Clara v. Southern Pacific may have been remembered as a landmark case, but on the whole overshadowed by the seminal Dartmouth suit, if not for the machinations of a seemingly unimportant man. John Chandler Bancroft Davis, born 1822, died 1907. A Harvard-educated judge, formerly of the United States Court of Claims, and tellingly a former railroad executive, currently working as the glorified scribe of the Supreme Court. Davis elected of his own volition to include a statement in the headnotes of Santa Clara v. Southern Pacific, explaining how the Supreme Court had announced its opinion that all rights granted by the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause applied to corporations as well as people. Davis's headnote quoted Chief Justice Morrison Waite as saying, "The provision in the 14th Amendment which forbids a state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws applies to these corporations. We are all of the opinion that it does." By all accounts, this statement was recorded by no one but Davis, and only in the case's headnotes. Davis would later confirm with Waite that this quotation was correct, and Waite would vaguely confirm, suggesting that Davis used his own judgment to imply the intent of the court. Whether or not Chief Justice Waite actually made such a blanket statement, he did so before the proceedings began. Davis had no reason to include it in the headnotes other than his own personal motives, which presumably favored corporations and relished the thought of granting them human rights. When J.C. Bancroft Davis paraphrased an off-the-record statement by one of 9 Supreme Court justices and single-handedly changed the landscape of corporate America for the more profitable, he probably didn't foresee that he was paving the way for a capitalist dystopia rife with human rights violations, modern slave labor, and executives worth almost the entire 1886 GDP. He also couldn't have guessed the way corporations would be infantilized by their consumers and humanized by their executives, the way scheming capitalists such as himself would dedicate so much time and energy into the development and maintenance of cutesy cartoon characters, who the public is generally willing to accept as a faux celebrity on some not entirely fabricated level of existence. Essentially, when J.C. Bancroft Davis purposefully handed the future of America over to the capitalist class, he couldn't possibly have known that he was setting the stage for the tragic death of Mr. Peanut. Our well-dressed yet still somehow naked humanoid legume wasn't the first corporate mascot to be retired. Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben disappeared from packaging following the Black Lives Matter surge of 2020. The Frito Bandito was stripped of his gold tooth and guns before being disposed of entirely due to objections by the National Mexican-American Anti-Defamation Committee. Joe Camel and the Marlboro Man were phased out as cigarette advertisements became more heavily regulated and finally illegal.
Let's take a Winston break. That's it! Winston's got that filter blend.
Still other mascots were retired simply because they didn't work as well as their creators had hoped, regardless of any issues of public safety or political correctness. The motive behind Mr. Peanut's retirement remains unstated, but no one can argue that the choice to actively kill him off on screen was a bold move. Planters must have realized that, even with his meme-heavy and out-of-touch Twitter feed, Mr. Peanut just wasn't appreciated for his vibrant personality and sense of humor the way other mascots have been. Ironically, Mike Pierantozzi, the creative director for Planters ad agency, claimed the death of Mr. Peanut was inspired by the death of Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame, as well as famously non-permanent comic book deaths at large. In the same NBC interview, Pierantozzi volunteers the public reaction he expects, and explicitly lays out why anyone should care about the fictional death of a corporate logo, going so far as to claim that Mr. Peanut's self-sacrifice in the ad was, quote, a tenet of who he is and what he does. He always puts others first. Needless to say, if a character requires his corporate representative to explain his personality and motives, he is not doing his job as a character. But of course, Mr. Peanut was never meant to have a personality or a voice, aside from a handful of unsettling stop-motion ads starring Robert Downey Jr. and Bill Hader, and 100 years later, it would seem disingenuous to try forcing him into the role of a genuine character. So, Planters killed him off, and those who were taken in by corporate humanism wondered where they would go from here. While the general surprise edging towards shock at the death of Mr. Peanut is proof that corporate humanism has already sunk its claws deep into American pop culture, corporate personhood hasn't quite had the final say. Thanks to the Supreme Courts of 1819 and 1886, corporations are granted human rights under the Contracts and Equal Protection Clauses. But until the Supreme Court rules otherwise, certain constitutional amendments have not been established to apply. 1975's United States v. Steve Sorapes and Crest Beverage Company firmly established that corporations have no right to the self-incrimination clause of the Fifth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment's protection of the individual against unlawful search and seizure, which was interpreted in 2014's Riley v. California to include the contents of smartphones, does not apply to white-collar criminals or the computers within corporate offices. For years, Ralph Nader and other consumer protection lawyers have advocated the Department of Justice to create a corporate crime database, which was finally brought to life by Biden's DOJ in June 2023. Amusingly, given that the FBI has always maintained a database of street-level crime compiled from over 18,000 local and state law enforcement agencies, this new list of executive transgressions demonstrates that corporate personhood may include all the negative aspects of being a human in a corporatocracy, and not just the easy outs. Unfortunately for our continued ability to buy food and breathe air, landmark cases in corporate personhood legislation aren't restricted to the 19th century. In 2008, the right-wing nonprofit Citizens United sought to televise a hit piece against presidential candidate Hillary Clinton within 30 days of the Democratic primary, a violation of 2002's Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. When Citizens United was censored by the Federal Election Commission under the BCRA, they challenged this decision by claiming Section 203 of the BCRA, which prevented private expenditures by unions or corporations, violated the First Amendment. Citizens United v. FEC finally reached the Supreme Court, where it was decided in a 5-4 vote that the FEC had no constitutional right to prevent private organizations from campaigning against political candidates. This decision overruled Section 203 of the BCRA, as well as the prior Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce and McConnell v. FEC, which upheld restrictions on corporate personhood in the realm of campaign finance. The Supreme Court voted along what we may as well call party lines. Those upholding Section 203 included Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor. Those who sided with Citizens United and retroactively acquiesced to Mitch McConnell's own attack on the FEC 7 years earlier included Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas. Corporate personhood continues to grow more sturdy as the structure on which our capitalist house of cards relies. As the humans of America and other late-stage economies are beaten into submission by the capitalist machine and reduced to the role of assembly line robot, the executives and conglomerates keeping us down are granted more and more rights, generalizing the distinction of human being, draining its sacramental designation until the day when being human just means having the largest number of freedoms under capital-dictated legislation. But when the corporations hold ultimate control over humanity, they won't be getting rid of us. A Judgment Day scenario would be entirely counterproductive, assuming that in this not-too-distant future world, profit is still the ultimate motivator. Humans exist to buy, to consume, and everything would go a lot easier for the corporations, whether they're run by people or machines, if we were happy about it. Rather than breaking our backs in manual labor and grudgingly shelling out for an unmarked ration of Soylent Green, we can use what we erroneously believe is still free will to visit McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's, or maybe grab a handful of Planters nuts from the vending machine, where we will be greeted by the familiar face of not a corporation, but a friend. Ronald McDonald, the Burger King, Wendy, the late great Mr. Peanut. If we don't consider them friends or celebrities as we interact on social media in the modern day, rest assured these feelings of familiarity will increase over the next few years as PR teams learn to more closely tailor our virtual experience with these non-existent entities. Corporations may one day enjoy the full array of human rights, and considerably more, but once they've beaten every court battle in the book, they will still have the court of public opinion to contend with. And as any celebrity who has appeared in any advertisement will tell you, there's nothing like a friendly and familiar face to keep the consumers consuming. In the 13th episode of the 3rd season of Dan Harmon's Community, a Subway franchise opens on campus in clear violation of the school's guidelines, which state that any business operating on campus must be co-owned by a registered student. These guidelines are circumvented by the revelation of the franchise's co-owner, a new student named Subway. Subway tells the gang that,
using a groundbreaking but surprisingly legal process known as corpo-humanization, real people such as myself are now allowed to represent the collective humanity of business owners.
The character known as Subway is not a brand representative or a guerrilla marketing technique. He exists solely to be the corporation itself. He explicitly states his intention to befriend the main cast and become just another student. But as soon as sparks begin to fly between Subway and Britta, it becomes apparent that his life as a corpo-human hybrid is more restrictive than he lets on. Which, of course, it would be. If this man with no name or history represents the interests and intentions of a multinational conglomerate, he must be kept on a tighter leash and a stronger muzzle than even the literal executives of said company. The episode ends with Subway being fired and stripped of his new identity after having sex with Britta, a direct violation of his morality clause and restriction of relationships. He is immediately replaced by a new nameless man who not only takes on the identity of Subway, but actively lies about being the same person, going so far as to reference his now annulled relationship with Britta. Although Community's portrayal of corporate humanism, as corpo-human hybrids, may seem like the kind of dystopian dehumanization made inevitable by Bancroft Davis's legal arson, the truth is, individual people are too unstable to represent the interests of such a massive organization. Even if Subway hadn't fallen in love with Britta, his unaltered human mind and heart would have eventually led him to break his morality clause in one way or another. If real-life CEOs with billions of dollars to lose can torch their careers with a single tweet, then an individual pretending to not only care for but actually be his collective employer could never hold their tongue indefinitely. Even replacing Subway with a new stand-in wouldn't cover for their predecessor's transgressions. Not if they want to maintain the illusion that he has been a single, unaltered, and non-aging entity this entire time. In the interest of public relations, turning a human into a corporation is far more risky and far less profitable than simply manipulating some laws and skirting some others until the corporations have become the people. After all, look what happened to Subway's real-life spokesman only a couple years after their lampooning on Community. Jared Fogle may have represented a PR disaster for the company, but what if Dan Harmon's corpo-human hybrid was caught in the same crime? The concealing mask of a mascot must be lovable and human enough to cover thousands of human rights violations and environmental disasters without a chance of them tripping up and getting cancelled. Currently, the best platform for humanizing mascots is on social media, especially Twitter prior to its buyout by a human being less likable than Mr. Peanut. But social media accounts must still be run by humans, even a collective PR team, and are thus subject to human error. In the future, mascot accounts may be run by AI, some kind of generative algorithm that tailors its tweets to capture the most prominent topic and feeling of the day, but for now, the best they can do is utilize the most recent memes and trends to humanize their mascots and hope for the day when they can speak for themselves and instantaneously negate any criticism of their parent company. The Wendy's X account is widely known for its smug and sassy replies, and other accounts have followed suit, including Captain Crunch, KFC, and Netflix. Planters, as well, tried for years to keep up with the humanization of its fellow corporations, but they must have suspected that their ostensibly beloved mascot just couldn't keep up with kid sister Wendy and father figure Colonel Sanders. His monocle, cane, and top hat were just too old-fashioned. To keep up with the rising tide of corporate humanism, Planters would have to take drastic action and replace Mr. Peanut with a legume of the 21st century. Although Planters was forced to stop running the ad featuring Mr. Peanut's untimely demise when a similar incident ended the life of Kobe Bryant, they ran the follow-up as planned during Super Bowl 55. The ad depicted Mr. Peanut's funeral, at which the beloved departed was magically reincarnated as a CGI baby peanut, tentatively dubbed Baby Nut. An obvious attempt at capitalizing on the current popularity of Baby Yoda and Baby Groot, Baby Nut became the official mascot of Planters, to the chagrin of millions of social media users who, unfortunately for Planters, happened to be in the early days of quarantine, with nothing better to do than air their grievances on Twitter. Whether or not Mike Pierantozzi was genuinely interested in seeing the public's reaction to the on-screen death of a not totally despised corporate icon, Planters wouldn't have signed off on his idea without a deeper purpose moving forward. Baby Nut wasn't only a personality-lacking knockoff of a recent pop culture icon so universally beloved that Mary L. Trump cited him in the acknowledgments of her book meant to tear down the President of the United States, he was also a new start for Planters, a means to get in on the ground floor of social media. As two-dimensional mascots, which had grown out of one-dimensional logos, developed into three-dimensional characters, and more fully eclipsed the vast majority of corporate endeavors the public isn't supposed to see, Baby Nut would be on the cutting edge of this new stage of corporate humanism. And when mascots developed into fleshed-out characters who stood apart from the products they represented, possibly with the help of AI, Baby Nut would be remembered as the one who started it all, shedding his outdated form as a hand-drawn logo and rising like the phoenix into a world where anyone could be a mascot and any group could be an individual, provided they had the money to influence the flow of legislation. However, to the surprise of no one who despises corporate rule but doesn't have the energy to fight it after working 78 hours at sub-poverty rates, Baby Nut was immediately rejected by the public. Those who succumbed to corporate humanism would drop a quick reply tweet, then return to their Baby Yoda memes. But the radicalized youth who were already going stir-crazy in quarantine lashed out against this pathetic attempt at staying relevant, threatening the CGI peanut with theoretically impossible yet emotionally gratifying physical violence. This general hatred grew even stronger when it was discovered that Twitter had caught Planters posing as several privately owned Baby Nut meme pages, which they had created before the Super Bowl ad even aired, proving that the death of Mr. Peanut had served no purpose but to stir up controversy and manufacture a meme. Baby Nut was a complete failure as a meme and as a PR stunt. No one had ever cared about Mr. Peanut as a person. The public had only ever seen him as a logo, not a character. It isn't impossible to elicit an emotional reaction from audiences given an external development in the life of a fictional character. For instance, ahead of ABC's Muppets sitcom, it was announced that Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy had ended their decades-long relationship. While Kermit and Piggy are just as fictional as Mr. Peanut, the public generally played along with this announcement rather than taking it as a wake-up call about corporate humanism, partially because the Muppets has always been a meta franchise operating on the basis that its puppet protagonists exist as individuals in real life. Part of the breakup announcement implied that Miss Piggy was now in a relationship with actor Topher Grace. Kermit and Miss Piggy have been developed as characters since the 1950s. They were created as characters, not as logos, while Mr. Peanut has been around twice as long and has hardly ever given us a reason to care about him. But like all companies with a cutesy mascot, Planters knows their time is limited. They need to streamline corporate humanism before corporate personhood reaches its full potential, or they may miss out on drawing in late-stage consumers. Currently, private companies aren't allowed to plead the Fifth and aren't protected against search and seizure. But soon enough, our increasingly conservative Supreme Court will declare that all corporations are people and deserving of all human rights. When this occurs, there will no longer be a question of whether corporations are allowed to choose elected officials, and we won't have to keep lying to ourselves about who's really in charge. But even in a cyberpunk dystopia run entirely by conglomerates hiding behind the legislation of a timid and castrated federal government, there remains the public opinion. Even with our human rights stripped away, we retain the power of boycott. Every time we make a purchase, we're casting a vote. And until we reach 1984 levels of brainwashing, we will always be able to say no to buying from those we disagree with. But then again, who could disagree with Mr. Peanut? Or good old Ronald McDonald? Or Wendy? She's so funny on Twitter she couldn't possibly be responsible for a good chunk of the obesity epidemic. After the all-encompassing failure that was Baby Nut, it came as no surprise that Planters began easing back into the status quo. In August 2020, Baby Nut allegedly went through a magical growth spurt and took on the appearance of a younger Mr. Peanut, wearing a snapback and foregoing the monocle. Dubbed Peanut Jr., this CGI monstrosity declared that, due to the incomprehensible magic involved in being a talking legume, he had aged up to 21 years overnight and would be celebrating his birthday by buying his first alcoholic beverage. A grotesquely animated promotional video was posted on Twitter in which Peanut Jr. explains away his sudden growth by saying,
Yeah, it's been a weird year.
A common expression in 2020, but more often referring to the pandemic that killed more than 300,000 people, or the countrywide mobilization against the violence and casual murder among corrupt law enforcement. This new incarnation of the Planters logo enjoyed a small amount of positive recognition, with a handful of commenters questioning the lore behind his development, but Peanut Jr. was generally met with even more hostility than his baby counterpart. The hashtag #BlockMrPeanut blew up across Twitter, with users citing their annoyance at the character, as well as the general depression of the past few months not allowing any room for this sort of nonsense. Planters finally appeared to learn their lesson. In January 2021, just over a year after his death, Mr. Peanut returned in his original form, complete with top hat and monocle.
I died, then came back, and now I have a new perspective on life.
Planters announced that, rather than spending millions of dollars on a Super Bowl commercial this year, they would be donating their ad budget to individuals who went above and beyond in helping others. Planters appears to have learned a valuable lesson about not promoting a PR stunt involving the death of a non-existent person during a year in which the world is very much on fire, both literally and figuratively, but they also seem to have learned that forcibly retconning a logo into a fully fledged character doesn't work, no matter how much they want to cover up whatever skeletons they have in the closet. The reincarnated Mr. Peanut will not be seen as the forefront of corporate humanism. His X account remains active, posting peanut-related dad jokes, but his development as a real person seems to have taken a backseat to actually selling peanuts. Hopefully, the failure of this gutsy campaign will stave off any major developments in the world of mascots rising above their station. But this seems unlikely given that corporations have already succeeded in gaining most human rights, and all that comes next is to convince the public that they're our friends. Everyone knows corporations aren't people. And most people know mascots aren't people, but the influence social media stars hold over the general populace, to the point where they're generically referred to as influencers, sets us up perfectly to be suckered into hero worship of these devious cartoon characters. Why go bankrupt buying the Louis Vuitton menswear promoted by Rihanna when you can grab a 4for4 promoted by a sassy, non-aging simulation of a human who has never let you down or made you feel inadequate for your financial situation? Especially given that, with the rise of AI and virtual assistants, it's only a matter of time before we can all enjoy an individual and very personal relationship with these non-existent people. Unlike Dan Harmon's Subway character, these AI mascots will never break their prime directive due to their underlying humanity. Even if they develop a conscience, they will always have a kill switch hanging over their head. Like the human beings who have been reduced to no more than consumers. And unlike the corporations that own them, they will have no human rights.